Welcome to episode 5 of What Happened to Prisoner Justice Day, a podcast mini-series about the history of prisons in Canada, focusing on differences in the prison system in the 1960s to 1980s versus today. This episode features Anne Hansen. Anne is an anarchist who was arrested in the 1980s for participating in an underground guerrilla group called Direct Action. She ended up getting a life sentence and doing 7 years in Kingston's prison for women, which is now closed. She also got her parole revoked on 2 separate occasions, once in 2006 and once in 2012. In the interview that follows, Anne talks about the differences between doing time in the prison for women in Kingston versus GVI, the Grand Valley Institute, one of the regional federal prisons for women that was built after P4W was closed. Anne also mentions Quinte, which is a provincial prison in Kingston, Ontario, where she also did a bit of time. In the interview, you can hear Anne's dog whining in the background, so a heads up that that's what the background noise is.
Well, my name's Anne Hansen. Back in the 80s, I was part of a group called Direct Action, which was kind of like an anarchist urban guerrilla group. At the time, there were a lot of urban guerrilla groups all over the world that had sort of, like in Europe and in the United States, modeled themselves more or less after like the national liberation movements in Africa and South America and that. But we were like at the tail end of this sort of the urban guerrilla. I guess you could say it was like a movement almost, globally. But we did have a lot of influence from the feminist movement, Indigenous people, anarchists, environmentalists. So we were not Marxists, which most urban guerrilla groups were at that time. And we did a number of actions. We blew up a transformer of this Chikai Dunsmuir line that was just being constructed to prevent the expansion of the pulp and paper industry on Vancouver Island. And then we did a bombing of the Lytton plant in Toronto, which was producing the guidance systems for the cruise missile before it had even been tested as a weapon. Unfortunately, a few people were injured because we mistakenly thought that the authorities would follow our, precautions and warnings and things of clearing the building. There were people working at the time and shutting off the roads, but they didn't. So there was a big lesson learned there. Never sabotage a place where people could, or anybody could be hurt, and expect that the authorities will clear it if you give them a warning. And then there was the red hot video fire bombings, which were at that time sort of cutting edge. Porn shops, but they did specialize more in violent porn and pedophilia. It was a lot of porn that was, non-consensual. It wasn't just sort of erotica. And they were trying to normalize it by putting these red hot videos in suburban strip malls and stuff like that. And then we were arrested, and we were all convicted and did various lengths of time. We were on, it was, the prison for women was just like, if you see an old Hollywood movie about a sort of stereotypical old prison, that's exactly what P4W looked like. Just, there were tiers, like 2 ranges actually, one on each side of the building, and there were 2 tiers on each range. And then they had, in the 70s, during sort of, I guess, Keynesian economics, it was a reform period. They bought some military barracks and attached them to the prison for women, and that became the minimum security unit. And they bought a giant gym as well from the Royal Military College, and also put that in there. But a lot of us stayed on the ranges, like it was a conscientious choice. Mm-hmm. And we were very, in many ways we were isolated from the guards because the surveillance was very different than what it is today. Like there were no audiovisual, technological audiovisual systems. So we didn't have any, of those little, blue eyes, in the range. There was no intercoms throughout the ranges. So the guards, they made like an hourly count. They would just walk on through. And, they were also fairly vulnerable, so they really weren't always that provocative. Like, for example, like homosexuality was the norm. Everybody had shams on their doors. And if the guards were walking along and the shams were shut, they knew that something was going on in there. And they would very rarely open them. They'd just say, "Who's in there?" And we'd respond, right? So it wasn't like it was great, but in a sense, it was kind of, in a lot of ways, like a little autonomous women's community with being run by this sort of military dictatorship from afar, you know? But when I left, which was in 1990, 91, in that period, things did change. But I wasn't in P4W at that time when they had the riot and segregation, like that was aired on Fifth Estate when the Goon Squad came in and cut the women's clothes off, and it ended up being aired. Then they turned one of the ranges into sort of like a special handling unit. Yeah, so that was more in the mid 90s to until they actually closed the prison, that they began to use like really separate the women into different security levels, and they shipped off women who they considered behavioral issues, like that they considered to have behavioral issues that were sort of a threat to themselves or the population, to special isolation units in the men's prisons. And some women were even sent over to KP, to the treatment center. But I wasn't there then, so I don't have any sort of first-hand experience with that. I only have first-hand experience with P4W, and then when I was suspended and I went to GVI a couple of times in 2006 and 2012. So. The problem with remand prisons in general is that there's this constant movement of prisoners. You know, like, people are never there for very long. And so there's never any time to establish relationships, solidarity. So, like, you know, you get women who are coming in and out all the time. Like, there are, you know, people who live on the street. They're in and out of Quinte all the time. They get to know the guards better than that they get to know the prisoners. So you had, in general, when you do not have a prison environment that is stable, like, in other words, you have a cell, you're in the same cell for years, you get to know the other people on the ranges or in these pods or whatever you want to call them, it causes so much disruption in general. Like, it would be just like in this house. If you were living in this house and people were constantly coming and going, you would never establish any kind of security or deep, intense relationships. And that's what I found was going on in Quinte. But I think that the authorities, and when you look at, you know, criminology departments, for example, in universities that have been operating for who knows how long now, like decades, and psychology departments that also have students working as criminologists as well. I mean, I'm sure that they have studied this, and they can see that one of the most threatening things to a prison is having prisoners develop deep bonds of solidarity, unity. And so I noticed right away when I was suspended in 2012, especially in the maximum security unit, and apparently on the compound as well. They seemed to have a policy. Nobody ever verified it, but people were constantly being moved. I can speak for the maximum security unit. Like, I was moved twice, and I was only there for 3 months for no apparent reason. And I watched, even before I was moved, from one pod, which is like 5 women per pod, I watched other women being moved. Like, the pod would be completely simpatico, you know. There would be no conflicts between women, and all of a sudden a woman would be moved to another one. And then, disruption of what was going on. And I phoned out to the street when, you know, I had a phone call with somebody, and it was a guy, and he'd been when he was very young, he became a cadet and joined the military. And he speculated that it was to cause disruption, and that this was something that they did in the military all the time. They would move guys in the barracks to prevent them from developing stronger bonds of unity with each other than they did, sort of their bonds of obedience to their commanding officers, because, you know, they didn't want any kind of rebellions going on. And recently I spoke with a woman who was in P4W with me, And she spent 7 years in GVI. She's also a lifer and had her parole suspended and revoked. And I had not even talked to her about this. And she mentioned independently how odd it was that they kept taking women, like they called them units. They're like these so-called bungalows, right? Like they call them units now because the women are more politicized. They stopped calling them bungalows at a certain point. She said they were always moving people for no apparent reason. And she came to the same conclusion without me even bringing the topic up. She said, I know it's because they don't want us to get too close, you know. And she's not political, like, so she didn't use sort of political words. And so I'm assuming that this is something that criminology students, psychologists, you know, who work within the CSC hierarchy have realized is a way of preventing organized, like, work stoppages, possible riots, any kind of organized resistance. And it does work. It does create a lot of dissension and discord, conflict amongst the women. Like, there's certain cliches you hear all the time, like, no matter how long ago you were in prison or whatever, people always say, oh, it used to be so solid. Now everybody's always ratting out. And you always hear that the men's are way more solid, like that they stick to, like, Prisoner's Justice Day. Like, if a guy eats, he gets beat up. That is not the case in GVI or even in P4W. I think that what they also have started doing is, like, everything is a privilege, you know, and that does cause a lot of breakdown in solidarity. Like, people have said that in the past they didn't have the opportunity to have as many passes, or they wouldn't consider a lot of things privileges that they would take away. And so I think that the prison authorities have also learned how to use just about everything, like, well, getting transferred from the maximum security unit onto the compound, for example, is something you have to earn. So, you know, after a while, if you're in this pod of 5 people and everybody's constantly moving, and let's say you have children and you'd like to have go to the family unit to see them, like, that's a very powerful tool that they can use against you as your own family. Like, if you do not comply, and if you're not, you know, and the guards, you know, they come on the unit every day and try to have meetings with people, you know, so that I think there's a lot of pressure that is put upon people when they use everything as a privilege. Like, even I've heard from the Indigenous women, like, participation in sweats, for example, is supposed to be a right, but from all accounts, it's also used as a privilege. Like, they'll say stuff like that, well, you can't go, this woman can't go because she is unstable and it is suicidal. She has to be kept in a 24-hour surveillance. Like, they use excuses like that. So when they use everything as a privilege rather than as a right, something that you can expect to get no matter what, then I think it really does break down solidarity.
I know you weren't in like the first years when Prisoner Justice Day was starting, but if you could talk a bit about what Prisoner Justice Day looked like when you were in P4W.
Prisoner's Justice Day, everybody didn't eat. I mean, I don't know, just people, it was just one of those things where everybody did not eat. There was, you know, quite a bit of peer group pressure for people who really wanted to eat or whatever. We didn't have any kind of events around it. What was weird to me was when I went to GVI in 2006, it hadn't been open that long. And I think it was still sort of following a little bit of a reform paradigm, because the administration at GVI had actually facilitated this sort of, like, there were drummers, like Indigenous drummers. Kim Pate came in and there was women from the compound who spoke on a little, you know, platform about Prisoner's Justice Day. There was a film event in one of the activity rooms where they showed films that were made by the Joyceville Lifers group, which were really pretty good. And I was really taken aback by this, you know. So they allowed women to make Prisoner's Justice Day t-shirts. But when I went back in 2012, it was all outlawed completely. They weren't allowed to make T-shirts. There was even women, like prisoners, who were condemning some women who had made T-shirts by hand, you know? So that was all part of, I think, like the Harper regime. This was during the Harper area, and this sort of really crackdown on the administrations to try to abolish Prisoners' Justice Day, really. Yeah, so it was a big change. But in all those years in P4W, it was mainly a day where people didn't eat and on their own reflected about, you know, the women who died in there that they knew and that sort of thing. People who didn't participate were really frowned upon, to say the least. I wouldn't say beat up, but there was a lot of peer group pressure if people didn't participate because it was the right thing to do, so.
One of the other things that has come up in the interviews that I've been doing around like what's changed or what were the biggest changes or the changes that had the biggest impact was also something you talked about in your book, which is changes to the protective custody policies. Mm-hmm. And I think you weren't in P4W by the time those changes started getting implemented, but do you have a sense of like what the changes in protective custody were and how they ended up affecting people's sense of trusting each other or having a bit of solidarity on the inside?
Yeah. Well, in P4W, I was part of there was an inmate committee at the time, and I was on it for a very brief period of time. And I became very disillusioned with it. But, yeah, I remember George Caron telling us at this inmate committee meeting that the CSC was going to start integrating protective custody prisoners into population, and without knowing beforehand, the whole inmate committee just told him, like, this is outrageous, not just for us, but even for the protective custody women, you know? And we all walked out. But it wasn't implemented. This was not that long before. I think it took about a year or so before they actually did implement the integration. But yeah, it was definitely integrated when I went back into GVI there in 2006 and 2012. I don't know how much it would have had to do with solidarity, because the women who were in protective custody, at least when I was in P4W, were all women, I would say. I don't know of anybody who was in protective custody because they were a rat. Mm-hmm. Women who were isolated, like, you know, by the population because they were rats. And I have to say, quite often that word was used very loosely. But women would usually just check into segregation. And sometimes they'd stay there for a long, long time, like years. You know, they would isolate out of fear of the population, you know. I don't remember anyone being put into protective custody by the administration because they were considered rats. They were all women. Carla Homolka wasn't in when I was there, but they were all women who had killed a child. And I must say I'm a bit sympathetic towards them because from what I've heard, a lot of it could have been errors, you know, women who shook their baby, or I don't know. That's another big topic. So now when I was back in GVI, there was, again, the women were in population and they were definitely pariahs, you know, people were always picking on them, and some of the women had done really horrifying things. I mean, you've read in the paper. But the women who were considered protective custody were still, by and large, women who had killed a child. And, you know, the accusation of women being rats is always rampant since I've been in there. It's just, you know, the way things, even on the street here, you know, people gossip about one another, but in prison, it's very, like, I've always been very critical of that, you know, like, if you're going to accuse somebody of being a rat, you should have absolute proof, like evidence that someone went to court and testified, not just that you saw them speaking to a guard at the gate, which is what happens. People don't like somebody, you know, they're kind of very low on the pecking order, and they're walking through the barrier talking to a guard for a few minutes. Well, they could be saying any number of things that are completely innocent, but they'll be right away, oh, she's a rat, you know. It's just, you know, the way things go, I guess. There are informants in every prison, but I think quite often it's not the people that get labeled rats. You know, it's different, I think, you know. I think the warden, like, they often will call people. Like, I got taken to custody when at GVI. You don't get told why you're being taken custody. You can't just go, I'm not going. Well, you could, But even then, they'd probably drag you there, right? Mm-hmm. So you go, and it could be any number of weird things. Mm-hmm. And one time I got taken there, and there was a couple of RCMP people there, cops. And I was sitting in the room before this woman came in, and she looked just like a punk. Like she was all like cool, She did piercings, but her hair and her clothing, it was obvious that she dressed up to play this role. And she did introduce herself within a minute as working for the RCMP. And I was really taken aback. And she wanted to talk to me, she said, about my core beliefs. And I said I wanted to go back to the pod. She tried a few times. She kept, even though I kept saying I want to go, I'd like to go back to the pod. I was just kept like you'd say if you want to see your lawyer. And she did eventually, after maybe 10 minutes of trying to convince me to talk to her about she kept saying, you don't have to tell me names of anybody. We don't have to talk about your friends or people in population. I just want to know, I just would like to have a political discussion with you.
But that was more recently, right?
That was in 2012 when I was in the pod. Right. So I'm just saying, when it comes to being informants, let's say, any number of people can be taken down to the warden's office, and people are. I was taken down to the warden's office too when I first went to P4W, and they want to chat. And you don't know who actually would chat and complain at some point about one of their fellow prisoners who's really, let's say, bullying them or something. I mean, just don't know. P4W is not great, but compared to GVI, I have fond memories because the relationships with the women were so great and the physical structure was set up for that. I was in the same cell for the entire time, and I had women who were right. It was, let's say we're all in prison together and we're all right beside each other. Can you not see how close we all get? Mm-hmm. Every day we go down for coffee, and whenever there's a 2-week lockdown, we would be passing each other food and notes. You know what I mean? You get this incredible relationship that you'll never have again in your life of intense, really deep relationships, I can't, and I still, in some ways better than any other period of my life when it comes to relationships with other women. And no guards standing around watching you. You can talk about anything. You know what I mean? And then GVI, like the pod was horrible. 5 women. And there was this one woman who was a total bully. Like I thought it was me at times. But then a woman who I really respected, who I ran into in the library there. I guess I shouldn't mention names. We'd chat, and it's just the way it was. And again, I think we both were aware it was because of this constant movement. And there did seem to be more prisoners, and possibly it's because of this lack of solidarity and collectivity. There were these sort of right-wing prisoners too, who'd say stuff like, "What? Don't complain. This is soft. This is what the bully." I'll just call her the bully on our pod. Out of 5 women, she ran the show. She saw herself as the tough, and she was sort of tough. Yeah, 20, But she'd be, if you complained, she'd say, "What are you complaining about? This is nothing. This is soft." So it's weird, that twist, right? So then everybody sort of starts shutting up about complaining. And there was this sort of like little tough gang mentality amongst some women that was very bullying, even on the compound. And like people who were uptight about some women, like I said, making hand-painted Prisoners Justice Day t-shirts. So that I never saw in P4W ever. Like there was never this sort of what I would call kind of a right-wing group of prisoners. I mean, not everybody got along, but politically, there was never this sort of group of people who were uptight about, let's say, people wanted to fast or have a hunger strike, which we did a few times for very short periods of time.
I'm wondering if during any of those instances when people were doing things on the inside, you were successfully able to reach out to people on the outside and get support from the outside, and what that would look like.
Not really. You know what? Not really. Even though out in BC, I think it was more the case at that time, because the BC had clerical Hain, joint effort started at that time. But I'm just being honest here. I don't think there were people who came in. There were volunteers who came in. The Native Sisterhood had a really good network of Indigenous elders and stuff. But really, it's very different. I know Gail Horry, for example, I can use her name, was the inmate chairperson, as they were officially called, for many years. And she was really political and spent tons of time writing to different women's groups and different political groups, but really there was never a good connection. And I think a lot of it is because it was very difficult to establish that with the prisoners. Like, you have to get permission to phone people, you have to get approval to come in and visit, and when something happens, it often happens quickly, and then being able to contact those people.
What kind of volunteers were coming inside? What kind of programming was there when you were
Well, it was really more Elizabeth Fry, and then there was some university courses, so there were some Queen's professors that were coming in, and religious groups, of course. There were religious people. And the Indigenous, I'm not Indigenous, so I'm probably leaving that out. The Native Sisterhood had the best support system, because they had... there was, people living even here in Kingston who went in all the time, and Indigenous elders who would, like Ellen Moves Camp from South Dakota, very well known. She came regularly to the sisterhood meetings, and it was a whole different ballgame for the Indigenous community. In the Native Sisterhood in P4W was really groundbreaking and great.
Thanks for listening to the 5th episode of What Happened to Prisoner Justice Day. In the summer of 2018, Anne released a book about her time in prison, and you should definitely check it out. The book is called Taking the Rap: Women Doing Time for Society's Crimes, and it recounts Anne's years in prison in the 1980s and her 2 shorter stints inside on parole revocations in the 2000s.